Debate Night in Pennsylvania, sponsored by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association.
It's debate night in Pennsylvania. Face to face, debating for the very first time. You will hear from the two candidates fighting for your vote. Senator Bob Casey.
He should go to the grocery store in Pennsylvania. I don't know what it's like in Connecticut. He spends most of his time in Connecticut. He lives up there.
And challenger Dave McCormick.
He only pokes his head out of his hole once every 6 years. And that's what's happening right now with Punxsutawney Bob.
It's a critical seat in a battleground state that could decide control of the Senate and the White House. The issues that matter most to the voters will make all the difference.
I'm voting for integrity. Cheaper grocery bills.
Prices that come down.
Our economy.
Taxes and abortion.
Tonight, you get to decide which candidate will earn your trust, which one shares your values on the social issues and your dreams for our future, and will earn your vote. Live from your local election headquarters in Harrisburg, this is the Pennsylvania U.S. Senate debate. Good evening from the nation's capital. I'm your host, Leland Vittert from News Nation. It's debate night, and the stakes are high, not only for the Keystone State, but for the country, as the balance of power in the Senate takes center stage. Our moderator for tonight's debate is Dennis Owens, political anchor and reporter from WHTM in Harrisburg. We're broadcasting tonight's debate across the country on News Nation, as well as on stations that reach all 67 Pennsylvania counties, from Philadelphia to Harrisburg to Erie. Before we get to the questions, let's review the debate rules. Mr. Casey, Mr. McCormick, you will have 60 seconds to answer a question. If there's a follow-up question, you will get 30 seconds to respond. Each rebuttal also gets 30 seconds. Time for answers will be displayed by a digital clock that will count down to 0, and Dennis will move things along when time is up. Each candidate will also have 90 seconds for a closing statement. Now, live from the ABC 27 studio in Harrisburg, it's debate night in Pennsylvania.
Thanks so much, Leland. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited to have the two candidates in our studio tonight for the next hour, talking about the topics important to Pennsylvania voters. And we encourage you, if you're watching tonight, to share your thoughts on X using the hashtag PA Senate Debate. And importantly, it is there that you will find all of the sources that we used in developing tonight's questions. But now it is time to welcome the candidates. First, Republican Dave McCormick, former hedge fund CEO, West Point graduate, Army veteran, whose father was the first chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. Next, Democrat Bob Casey, a 3-term U.S. Senate incumbent, former state auditor general, and treasurer, whose father was a former governor. Gentlemen, we thank you very much for being with us tonight. Good luck, and with that, let's get started. Current headlines lead us to begin with the Middle East. This week, Iran launched nearly 200 missiles at Israel after Israel put troops in Lebanon and killed Hezbollah leadership, all as we approach the 1-year anniversary of the Hamas attack. You have both expressed support for Israel. Mr. Casey, we're going to begin with you. Are you willing to put American troops on the ground in the current conflict? You have 60 seconds.
Hey, Dennis, I want to thank you and ABC 27 for this debate, and I also want to wish Happy New Year to all of our friends across Pennsylvania celebrating Rosh Hashanah. This is a difficult time for the Israeli people. Just almost a year ago to the day, 1,200 Israelis were murdered by a terrorist organization, Hamas. Murdered in cold blood. Young people, older Israelis, killed by a terrorist organization. We've got to continue to support Israel's efforts to take on and defeat Hamas, and also to take on other threats in the region, including the threat posed by Hezbollah and the Iranians. I think that now that Iran has launched missiles against the Israeli people, we've got to stand with Israel and fight for them. Now, in terms of putting our troops on the ground, we've got to back up Israel and make sure that Israel has the resources it needs to fight against the Iranians.
But does that involve troops on the ground at the moment?
Well, not unless we have a declaration of war and a debate in the United States Senate and the House.
I do have a follow-up for you. Is there a red line Israel can cross to lose your support? You have 30 seconds.
No, Dennis, look, I've been a strong supporter of Israel every year I've been in the United States Senate, over and over again. That's why pro-Israel organizations across the country support me. They know my record. And I think they also know that my opponent's record is one of lifting up adversaries. As a hedge fund manager, he was managing money for President Xi of China, investing in China, increasing those investments by 108,000%, lifting up our adversaries instead of supporting America.
Well, let's turn to your opponent. Mr. McCormick, are you willing, let's start first, are you willing to put American troops on the ground in this current conflict? You have 60 seconds.
We need to stand with Israel. Israel's in the fight for its life. My wife and I went to Israel in January. We saw firsthand the brutality that Hamas brought to the Jewish people. We have a fight here at home and a fight abroad. We need to stand. And the original sin was the funding of Iran that Senator Casey was the deciding vote. Gave Iran $100 billion of sanctioned money that's been used to underwrite terrorism. Hamas, Hezbollah, that's where all these missiles are coming from. And now that we're in a fight, now that Israel's in a fight for its life, it's because of that weakness, that encouragement, that lack of strength and standing up against Iran and standing up against all its proxies in the region. So we need to stand with, I wouldn't send troops in on the ground right now. We need to stand, but what President Biden done, and I haven't heard Senator Casey speak out on this, is he's started to put red lines in place on what Israel should and should not do. We need to stand steadfast with Israel. Senator Casey's been a weak voice.
Follow up for you, though. Is there a red line Israel could cross to lose your support? You have 30 seconds.
Not as long as Israel's fighting for its life. It's the closest ally in the Middle East. It's the closest ally, one of the closest in the world. The problem is that we haven't been standing enough with Israel. Now, we also have a fight at home against anti-Semitism, and this is also a place where I think Senator Casey's been weak. He's endorsed Summer Lee, an avowed anti-Semite. He's got this anti-Semitism bill, which he sponsored. It's a good bill. He hasn't even been able to get a vote on the Senate floor, and this is a career politician. He says one thing, doesn't want to irritate or upset the radical elements of his party that are anti-Semites. We got to have strength, moral courage to stand up against Iran and anti-Semites at home.
Per the agreed-to rules of this debate, you will each get rebuttals on each of the topics. And Mr. Casey, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, when it comes to the question of moral clarity, here's what my opponent did. With his own money, he invested his own money, millions of dollars, in a website that platforms hate, Holocaust denial, and anti-Semitism. That's his money, and he's making money off of that. At least $100,000 he's made off of that investment. The second thing he did when he was running the biggest hedge fund in the world in Connecticut is to invest in a Chinese weapons manufacturer that had ties to Iran. Those weapons made their way to Hamas. So who's supporting Israel?
And your time is up there. Mr. McCormick, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Yeah, you're going to hear throughout this, you've heard throughout this campaign, when you don't have a record to run on, as Senator Casey does not, you attack your opponent. His voice is primarily attacking me. For your viewers tonight, I have a website that's been established today. It's just been launched, CaseyLies.com. You can go and see the actual facts by third-party sources of all the things he's saying. There will be lies throughout, but you should ask yourself, why is a senator with an 18-year track record, who should be able to run on his record, running his entire campaign with a negative set of attacks on me, most of them lies?
Thank you. Your time is up. Turning to the issue of immigration, we're going to begin with you, actually. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, at least 10 million migrants have crossed the border since 2021. Mr. McCormick, Donald Trump has stated if he's president, he wants to deport all those who crossed illegally. Do you support those mass deportations? And if so, how would the U.S. go about doing that? You have 60 seconds.
The border crisis is the direct result of the weakness of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and Bob Casey supported them every step of the way. What chutzpah to run an ad on how tough he is on the border when he voted against funding for the Border Patrol. He ran an ad in front of the wall that he voted against. He voted for sanctuary cities. He voted for federal benefits for illegal immigrants. And the fentanyl crisis that's come across our border is the direct result of the weakness of Bob Casey not standing up to these terrible cartels. So this man has very little that he can say with credibility on the border. We have an enormous crisis. We learned just recently that 25,000 convicted murderers and rapists have come across the border. Absolutely, we need to send them home. We need to deport first and foremost those convicted criminals. We have hundreds of people that are on a terrorist watch list. We have made Americans less secure. We've made our country less secure. We made Pennsylvania less secure because of the weakness of Bob Casey and the Democrats on this issue. I will be strong on this issue on day one.
15-second clarification. How would the U.S. go about doing that?
Well, that's the problem. I went to the board. I've been to the board twice. And Senator, you speak a lot about the board. I suggest you go. I've been there more times than the senator and the borders are. And what you see is these people come across the border, and in 2 days, they are let loose on our economy. So it's going to be very hard to track them down. It's going to be an enormous logistical challenge, but we have to do it to break the incentives of people coming across our border.
Thank you. I want to turn to Mr. Casey. In the past 6 months, President Biden has reintroduced policies similar to Donald Trump's that have reduced border crossings. Do you support the continuation of the former president's policies? You have 60 seconds.
Absolutely support those policies, and those numbers are coming way down. But here's the problem, Dennis. We don't have the resources at the border that we need. If we want real border security, we've got to invest in it. We've got to invest in hiring thousands more Border Patrol. That's in the bill that I voted for twice this year. The bill that my opponent opposes because the leader of his party said don't support it because it might help us politically not to have the problem solved. That same bill is supported by the Border Patrol Union. So I guess Mr. McCormick knows more about border security than the Border Patrol. I don't think so. That bill also would provide the investment we need in the technology to find fentanyl, to screen fentanyl. This is a vehicle problem coming across the border, often driven by American citizens, vehicles packed with fentanyl. We cannot allow that to continue. My opponent, unfortunately, as a hedge fund CEO, invested millions of dollars in the largest producer of fentanyl.
Mr. McCormick, 30-second rebuttal on immigration.
Well, Senator Casey is rich with his strength on the border when he's time and again voted against the measures that are necessary to get our border secure. He said very clearly when President Trump was president, we don't need a wall for border security. The fentanyl crisis, I sat with 4 fentanyl families very recently in my home in Pittsburgh. It's a tragic crisis. It's gotten out of control under Senator Casey, and this is something that we need leadership to go across the border and take on those cartels. Senator Casey's shown none of that leadership. He showed up now very recently as a strong advocate for the border. He hasn't even been there.
Thank you. Mr. Casey, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Talking about leadership, leadership would be a candidate, a Republican candidate for the United States Senate, talking a lot about border security. Leadership would be taking on the leader of your own party and anyone else and supporting the bill. That would be leadership. And that would be strength, not weakness, in the face of that pressure. The problem we have at the border is one where is one of a lack of investment in the strategies we know that work. Hiring more Border Patrol would help. He doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want to take on the leader of his party. And I also remind you, when he was running a hedge fund, he invested in the largest producer of fentanyl in China.
Thank you. I have a follow-up for you, Mr. Casey. The Blair County Sheriff blames you for the fentanyl death of his son, saying you have not done enough to secure the border. What is your response to that? You have 30 seconds.
Look, Dennis, I've met so many families across the state, and whether it's a sheriff in Blair County or a mom in Allegheny County, Janet, that I met, who talked about her daughter, Brianna. This is an awful, awful tragedy for those families. That's why we need to invest in the strategies that we know work. He won't do that because he's weak in the face of the political pressure from his own party. We can solve this problem by investing in the technology, hiring thousands more Border Patrol so we can inspect every single vehicle coming across the border for fentanyl.
Thank you. I have a follow-up for you, Mr. McCormick. There is reporting that says, as CEO of Bridgewater, you oversaw investments in a Chinese company that produced fentanyl. Can you explain those investments? 30 seconds, sir.
Yeah, it's laughable that he talks about independence. This is a man who's voted 99% of the time with Biden and Harris. This is a man who was recently asked on CNN, what do you disagree with Vice President Harris? He couldn't think of a single thing. I looked at that border bill. It's a bad bill. It's not a border security bill. It's an amnesty bill. I've looked at it compared to every other country in the world. It was a bad bill and I made my own choice. And I've shown myself to be independent from President Trump and anybody else. I am my own man. On fentanyl, the great irony of this is we invested at Bridgewater in many companies that were legally approved by the United States government. Senator Casey, in the ultimate sign of hypocrisy, invested personally in the very same company that he's referring to.
Okay, and I want to let you respond to that, sir. You have 15 seconds.
Not true, Dennis, and that was fact-checked. Look, Mr. McCormick,
You're right.
Mr. McCormick made a decision as a hedge fund CEO, the largest hedge fund in the world, when he was living in Connecticut, to invest in that company. He made that decision. The allegation he made against me was fact-checked, and it was shown to be a false charge.
Okay, quick.
Go to CaseyLies.com and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette editorial, which says what nonsense Bob Casey speaks of when he talks about his strength on fentanyl.
We need to move to the next topic. It's an
Thank you.
important one. You'll both agree. Every poll has shown that the economy is the #1 issue for Pennsylvania voters who agree the prices are just too high. Mr. Casey, we're going to begin with you. You have led efforts to target companies for so-called greedflation. Critics call that government price controls. Can you share an example of where price controls have worked to benefit consumers and not hurt businesses? 60 seconds.
First of all, Dennis, prices are too high, especially when you go to the grocery store to buy food or household items, items that people need every week or at least every other week. And these big conglomerates, these big corporations, rig those prices and jack them up to levels we've never seen, all while they're getting record profits. That's greedflation. We can take it on by passing a price gouging bill to go after those companies, hold them accountable. I'll argue with your premise. It's not price controls. It's investigating companies that are engaged in price gouging. You have to go into court and prove it, and they can rebut the arguments you make. That has to be proven. Here's the difference, though. I'm taking on this corporate greed. I want to pass a price gouging bill, and I want to roll back those big corporate tax breaks. He's defending them. Over and over again, he's defended these big corporations and said we shouldn't have price gouging legislation because he wants to support their corporate tax breaks. So he's perfectly fine with having price gouging. I want to take them on and hold them accountable.
Okay, thank you. And I have a follow-up for you, Mr. Casey. You were also targeting shrinkflation, companies charging the same for less product. We are 30 miles away from the snack food capital of the world. Have you investigated any of these Pennsylvania companies for shrinkflation? You have 30 seconds.
Well, I don't necessarily conduct investigations. We did a report on shrinkflation, which covered a lot of companies around the country. And if that's happening with regard to a Pennsylvania company or any other company around the country, they should be held accountable. When they take a product, shrink the contents of the product or the what's in a bag, and don't shrink the price, that's deceptive. That's ripping people off. People know this, Dennis. They go to the grocery store and they see it. It may not be in grocery stores in Connecticut, but it's happening here in Pennsylvania.
Should those Pennsylvania companies expect investigations?
Well, if we can pass legislation to have the same power at the federal level that attorneys general around the country have, yes, to hold those companies accountable. We should do that. Okay. He won't do that. He's against that. He doesn't want to hold them accountable. He thinks that they should just be able to engage in shrinkflation or price gouging. He doesn't want to hold them accountable.
I do want to turn to Mr. McCormick. If Donald Trump were to win, one of your first votes...
I need an opportunity to respond to that, Dennis.
Take 15 seconds.
Listen, when you're spent your entire life in public service, elected office, 30 years, you're like a hammer looking for a nail. The cause of inflation is the policies, the out-of-control spending of Biden, Harris, and Casey. Bob Casey voted 100% of the time for that $5 trillion of new spending. The experts at the time, Larry Summers, the San Francisco Fed, said this would create inflation. This has been tried in America.
You are going to have a rebuttal, so we'll let you get into that. But I do have a question I want to ask you.
Yes, sir, please.
If Donald Trump were to win, one of your first votes as senator would likely be expiring tax cuts. Critics say those tax cuts mostly benefit corporations and the wealthy. How would you vote on extending tax cuts, and why? You have 60 seconds.
I would be in favor of extending the Trump tax cuts. They are middle-class tax cuts as well. For a family that makes $50,000 a year, it's a $2,500 tax increase that would happen under Bob Casey. There's already been a 20% tax increase under Bob Casey because inflation is stealing money out of the pockets of working families. I would also, in that extension, want to add additional dollars for a child tax credit. I'd want to add money for fertility tax credit, IVF tax credit, which I proposed. But yes, I would extend those tax cuts, and the corporate tax cuts are necessary to ensure that America continues to be competitive. Bob Casey doesn't understand how the economy works. That's why he's trying to do all this economic voodoo stuff with price controls.
Let's further talk economy. A follow-up for you, Mr. McCormick. The national debt is at $35 trillion, just went past that this week and growing. Congressional Budget Office projects that tax cuts would add trillions more to the debt. How do you justify increasing that debt by extending those tax cuts? You have 30 seconds.
Well, listen, if you look at spending over the last 20 years, Republicans and Democrats alike have spent too much. Under Biden, Harris, and Casey, it's a hockey stick. $5 trillion of new spending. As I said, the experts said at the time, Bob Casey confidently said, no, this isn't going to cause inflation. It's caused record high inflation. So that's the main cause of inflation, and that's what's driven the debt. Now, we have a problem. When you have $1 trillion of interest payments, it's bigger than your defense budget, we have a problem. The first thing we need to do is roll back all these ridiculous subsidies for EV buses and charging stations, and billions that have gone into solar.
Your time is up.
This is what the economy's happened under Biden, Harris, and Casey.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Casey, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, you just heard his plan, Dennis. His plan is to double down on a debt explosion. We already had a debt explosion of $2 trillion under the 2017 bill. Now he wants to double down on that, support a bill in 2025 will jack up the debt by $4 trillion at least. Some people believe it's higher than that. That's his plan. You know what happens when that plan goes into effect? Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid are on the chopping block. We cannot allow that to happen. If we're going to have tax reform in 2025, it has to be a cut for the middle class.
Mr. McCormick, 30-second rebuttal.
Well, listen, the reason that Social Security and Medicare are, and the debt is such a spiraling out of control thing is because of the spending of Biden, Harris, and Casey. And Kamala Harris just gave her new speech, her new economic policy, $2 trillion of more spending and price controls that Bob Casey's promoting. Listen, as a senator, and Casey's lied about this as he lies about most things, I would support and stand by Social Security, stand by Medicare. I wouldn't accept any changes to those programs. And Senator Casey's lying if he says anything to the contrary.
Moving now to the topic of abortion. Mr. McCormick, during our 2022 primary debate in this very studio, you said you believe in only rare exceptions for abortion when the life of a mother is in danger. However, you now say you support additional exceptions. Tonight, can you clarify where exactly you stand on those exceptions? You have 60 seconds.
Yes, listen, this is an extremely polarizing issue. As you know, I have 6 daughters, so this is something we spend time talking about. I believe this should be a state's right. I believe states should decide. Pennsylvania has a law. It's been supported by Democrats and Republicans, like it was signed into law by the senator's father, Governor Casey. I support the 3 exceptions. I would not favor an abortion ban of any kind, legislation to support a national abortion ban. Senator Casey has voted for legislation. There's no senator in the Senate that's flip-flopped more on this issue than Senator Casey. Senator Casey has signed legislation that would allow abortions up until the due date and has government funding supporting them. And the thing that I said in that debate, I did say, and I'd also said before that and after that I was in favor of the 3 exceptions. You can find that on CaseyLies.com. My video recordings of my position. So my position hasn't changed, and Senator Casey's position has changed, and Senator Casey is lying about this because he wants to polarize this issue. It's a tough issue.
We have a follow-up for you on this, Mr. McCormick. You've said you do not support a national abortion ban, but are you concerned that women in other states don't have the same rights as women in Pennsylvania? You have 30 seconds.
Well, I'd say 2 things on this. I think it's important that voters decide. The voters in these different states have to decide what's best for them. They have different preferences, different desires. So that's why I say states' rights. In addition to that, I think we should talk more expansively about reproductive rights. And so one of the things I proposed is an IVF tax credit. When I was a CEO, I gave IVF to every single employee. It's hugely expensive. Right now, only wealthy people can afford fertility treatment. So we need to make fertility treatment much more accessible. We need to make contraception widely acceptable. Senator Casey is banging this drum, and he's the guy that has changed
We're going
his
to turn
position
to
more than
Mr.
anyone.
Casey right now. Thank you. You were first elected to the Senate as a pro-life Democrat, but in 2022, after Roe was overturned, you voted to protect abortion rights. What do you say tonight to voters who supported you based on that pro-life position? You have 60 seconds.
Dennis, in 2022, when the Supreme Court overturned a 49-year right, it overturned Roe v. Wade, I think everyone had to make a decision, including senators. I made a decision to support the Women's Health Protection Act. I don't support Republican efforts to ban abortion across the country. But just remember what Mr. McCormick just said. He talked about his position on abortion, but it's different than it was just 2 years ago when you asked that question. Your question was very specific. What exceptions do you support? And he said life of the mother, not an exception for rape, not an exception for incest. So his words now are a big change. But when the decision was made to overturn Roe, his reaction was that decision made him, quote, very, very happy, unquote. So that's where he's been on this issue. And when you talk about bans in other states, a woman in Florida hemorrhaging and it had to go on a ventilator before her life was saved. I don't think we want to see that in Pennsylvania.
I have a follow-up for you on that, however, Mr. Casey. Should there be any restrictions on abortion? 30 seconds.
Dennis, I support Roe v. Wade. And Roe v. Wade was the consensus across the country. It would allow reasonable restrictions. That's what I support.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, a rebuttal on abortion. You have 30 seconds.
Yeah, do you see that? So no person in the Senate has changed. Senator Casey said he wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade. Senator Casey was only for one exception, which was life in the mud. Now Senator Casey is saying this. He also just signed legislation that allowed abortions up into the 9th month. So different than what he just said. And he supports government funding for them. So I'm not going to take any preaching from Senator Casey on my position on abortion. And it's something that we need to get past and let people in all these states decide what's best for them.
Mr. Casey, you have a rebuttal, 30 seconds.
Yeah, Dennis, we've heard a couple of times tonight about telling lies. Look, probably the biggest lie told in this whole election, that probably most Pennsylvanians have never heard a bigger lie, was the lie when my opponent said he lived in Pennsylvania when he was living in Connecticut. The Associated Press on August the 14th, 2023, did a story that proved that he was living in Connecticut after telling people all throughout 2022, all throughout 22 and 23, that he lived in Pennsylvania. He lied about that.
I have a follow-up for you, but first I want you to respond 15 seconds to the residency question, which has plagued your campaign.
I'm going to need a little more than 15 seconds,
Take
given
30.
all that he said. So,
you got 30.
Listen, I'm a seventh-generation Pennsylvanian. I grew up in Bloomsburg, was born in Washington County. I went away to West Point, served in the military for 9 years, came back to Pittsburgh, created 1,000 jobs, or helped create 1,000 jobs as one of many people in a team. And so listen, I've spent the majority of my life in Pennsylvania. I did run a firm in Connecticut. When I said I was living in Pennsylvania, I was. Senator Casey is once again lying. So the fact that he got some reporter at the Associated Press to validate his lies or reinforce his lies does not mean it's true. And so people need to know that Senator Casey's lying. And why is he lying? Because he doesn't have a track record as a United States Senator to run on after 18 years.
Thank you. I want to give you 30 seconds to respond to that, sir.
Well, he told a lie, and I think most people know that now.
Okay.
He also lied about being a farmer. He said that while he was a candidate. He's not a farmer. He's a hedge fund CEO, or at least used to run a hedge fund. By the way, he's still benefiting from that hedge fund. He still benefits a lot from that hedge fund.
Okay. Mr. Casey, we're going to turn to you. Last week, Vice President Kamala Harris said she would support ending the filibuster to codify Roe v. Wade. Do you agree with lowering the threshold from 60 to 51 votes in the Senate to legalize abortion nationwide? 60 seconds.
Dennis, I've been on record for a good while now supporting lowering that threshold to 51 for a whole variety of matters and issues that come before the Senate. Right now, the filibuster acts as a block to make progress on background checks for common sense gun legislation to make sure that we have background checks in place supported by 85% of the American people. That's blocked because of the filibuster. Women's rights are blocked. Voting rights is blocked. Workers' rights, protecting workers' rights to join a union. All of that is blocked by the filibuster. So I would support it, and my opponent will continue to support the blocking of this, using this arcane rule to block progress, really as an excuse to not vote on major issues of the day. I think when people elect you to public office and elect a president and a Senate, we should vote on big issues and fulfill the wishes and the aspirations of those who voted for us.
Mr. McCormick, you have a question. You've said you do not support ending the filibuster.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't a simple majority in the Senate be enough to move legislation forward? You have 60 seconds.
Be very afraid. So I would support not eliminating the filibuster regardless of the party in the majority. Imagine a world where Kamala Harris and Bob Casey is in the majority in the Senate. You heard her speak. She wants to ban fracking. She wants to have mandatory buybacks of your guns. She wants to give citizenship to illegal immigrants. Bob Casey's a sure vote. He is a 99% vote for Biden-Harris. He'll be a 99% vote for Harris-Walz. That is what you're dealing with, a career politician who is too weak and too liberal to stand up against his own party. And so that's why I would vote against it. We shouldn't have extremes on either side. The Senate was meant to be the place where you would bring wisdom and reserve. And if Senator Casey is in the majority and Kamala Harris is president, there will be a set of policies that are completely out of step with Pennsylvania, completely out of step with the country, and it will be irreversible. That's why I'm opposed to it.
Mr. Casey, rebuttal on filibuster. You have 30 seconds.
Well, Dennis, look, this is a rule that should be changed. I think most Americans believe that progress should not be blocked on basic issues that people want us to make progress on. But look, he's not going to support it because he doesn't want us to make progress on those issues. He doesn't support the Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis legislation. He doesn't support the Women's Health Protection Act. He doesn't support legislation to protect unions. And he also doesn't want us to talk about his own record as a hedge fund CEO, where he made a lot of money investing in China and hurt Pennsylvania doing it.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, listen, I mean, we've talked about my business career. Bob Casey is not only anti-business, he's anti-success. I ran one of the great firms in the world. The funny thing about it is it was very successful. It invested about 3% of its investments in China, invested around the world. It was working for teachers, firemen, and policemen. But here's the best part of this whole thing. This is the career politician, Bob Casey. When he was the treasurer, he sat on the board of the teachers' pension plan right here in Pennsylvania, and he approved Bridgewater. He said it was a great firm. He approved all these investing strategies. So now that he's running against me, Bob Casey is using this as a way to come after me. He's anti-business, he's anti-success, and he's a liar.
I want to give you 15 seconds to respond to that.
Yeah, Dennis, let's fill in the blanks about what that hedge fund did in China. Invested in China's military, in companies that made bombers and missiles and aircraft carriers to help China. Invested, as I said, in China's largest producer of fentanyl. Invested in Chinese oil companies and steel companies while he was betting against American steel companies.
I appreciate it. Look, you're going to have 90-second closing statement. We've got to move to another topic, and it's a big one.
Can I get 15 seconds
Go
on
ahead.
this? Just very quickly. Bob Casey approved a $31 million investment in China Mobile when he was the treasurer. He's taken money, lobbyist money from a Chinese drone company. This is the kind of career politician lying.
Okay. And I don't want this to be a tennis match, but now I got to give you 15 seconds to respond to that.
We're supposed to believe this person who lied to the people of our state about where he lives? How does someone tell a lie to the people of the state he seeks to represent about where he lives?
Gentlemen, we need to move to the next topic. It's a big one you'll want to talk about. Fracking, natural gas industry are critical to Pennsylvania's economy. We're going to begin with you, Mr. McCormick. How do you plan to balance supporting the industries while also protecting the environment? You have 60 seconds.
Listen, what the Democrats have done and Bob Casey's voted for has been the most idiotic energy policy I've ever seen. So first of all, we constrained our natural resources, particularly fracking around the world in Pennsylvania. You don't have to ban fracking to ban fracking. All the things he's voted for and supports bans fracking. And essentially what's happened is we've lost our ability to be energy dominant. We've hurt ourselves in terms of creating these great jobs. It's not just not losing jobs. We have the 4th largest natural gas reserves in the world. We're blessed. And this natural gas is the way to a clean environment. Because of fracking, we've reduced carbon emissions in the United States by about 20%. Exporting our natural gas around the world and replacing coal-fired plants in India is the path to reducing carbon. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a conservationist. I also want great jobs for Pennsylvania, and I want to be secure. Bob Casey, and Bob Casey has made us more dependent on China because these huge subsidies for EVs and solar panels we have to buy from China. So 70% of the lithium batteries and the solar panels come from China. I can't think of a more stupid set of policies, and I'm anxious to hear
Time is up, sir.
Mr.
Casey, same question to you. How do you plan to balance supporting the natural gas industry and protecting the environment? You have 60 seconds.
Dennis, my record's pretty clear on this. Number one is I supported legislation just 2 years ago that made the greatest investment in clean energy in American history, allowing us to combat climate change, and at the same time have supported an all-the-above energy strategy for Pennsylvania. We have natural gas. I've always supported it in the extraction of natural gas. He's been the same guy who lies about where he lives has been lying about my position on fracking. I voted against a fracking ban. He won't tell you that because he doesn't want to talk about his own record as a hedge fund CEO. Investing in China's oil companies, managing money for Saudi Arabia's oil companies, investing in the rise of China. So many Pennsylvania jobs were lost because China was cheating, and he was helping them while they were cheating, investing in China and hurting Pennsylvania over and over and over again. The only common denominator here is when he made an investment that hurt Pennsylvania, the only commonality here is a lot of money went in his pocket.
Mr. McCormick, 30-second rebuttal.
You know, Senator Casey keeps coming back to my record because he can't defend his own. He can't defend his own on China. He's been in the Senate for 18 years. Ask yourself, where's his legislation get tough on China? Oh, it just came up a couple months ago. That's what happened. My mom's from Punxsutawney. Punxsutawney Bob pops his head out every 6 years and tries to act like he's doing things. This activity, it's all activity. He said on the LNG export ban that President Biden put in place, you know what he did to stop that? He sent a stern letter. That's what we have in this senator. A guy who keeps his head down, pops it up for political benefit, and gets nothing done.
We're out of time, Mr. Casey. You have a 30-second rebuttal, sir.
Well, look, I think the record of his investments are pretty damning. When you look at the investments in those China entities, whether it's a Chinese weapons manufacturer that had ties to Iran, why would you invest in a Chinese weapons manufacturer with ties to Iran, and then the weapons found their way to Hamas? The IDF found them after Hamas attacked the Israelis in the in the prosecution of that war against Hamas. Why would someone do that? It's because he wanted to make a lot of money and put it in his own pocket.
Another recent headline, Constellation Energy and Microsoft announced a plan to restart a reactor on 3 Mile Island, the site of the worst nuclear disaster in U.S. history. Mr. Casey, we're going to start with you. Do you support the reopening and the use of federal dollars for nuclear projects? 60 seconds.
When I said I'm for all the above energy portfolio, I include nuclear. We've got a strong nuclear base in Pennsylvania. I'm glad to see activity there at that site. We have to know more about what they're asking for. They asked for a loan guarantee, and that'll go to the Department of Energy. But look, Dennis, when we have those opportunities, we should take them to have investments made in our energy infrastructure or energy resources. But again, I'll go back to the same point. Mr. McCormick doesn't want to talk about those investments because he knows that people get a little uncomfortable when you've invested in an adversary and made money off of it. Over and over again, he's invested in adversaries and made a lot of money off it, and I don't think that's the kind of senator we want, because it seems like the same guy who spent time as a CEO prioritizing China now would go to the U.S. Senate and prioritize those billionaires. Hell, those billionaires are paying for more than half his ads. A small group of out-of-state billionaires supporting a candidate who is living out of state.
Mr. McCormick, same question. Do you support reopening 3 Mile Island, and would you approve federal dollars for such nuclear projects? You have 60 seconds.
Yes, I'm in favor of, as the Senator said, all forms of energy. What I'm not in favor of is hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies for clean energy projects that are driving inflation across our economy and across our country and making us more dependent on China. Senator Casey has a record of, again, that's a foe of the energy industry, not a friend of the energy industry. He's been for a cap and trade program that would have set up prices. He's for a regional gas initiative that would have raised prices. This is a senator who now says he wouldn't ban fracking, and Kamala Harris says they wouldn't ban fracking, so they now have synchronized flip-flopping. But this is not a guy who's been a strong friend of the energy sector and the natural gas sector. He said you can't drill your way to success. He said that he's introduced 6 pieces of legislation. He calls it fracking legislation. It's really anti-fracking legislation. He's contributed to the red tape that essentially bans fracking without actually banning fracking. So the senator here wants to have it both ways because he's a career politician. I'm for fracking, but I'm going to stand in the way of actual fracking with my behavior.
I want to turn to rebuttal to you, Mr. Casey. I wonder, do you have any concerns about a private company, in this case Microsoft, creating a nuclear power plant to serve its own needs? 30 seconds. I
do have concerns about that. That's why they got to make the case to me and to any federal agency. But I'm happy that there's activity at that site so that we have some activity for our energy sector. But look, let me just go back to what my opponent just said. The same guy who claims to know more about border security than the Border Patrol is now claiming he knows more about my record than the energy workers who support me. I got the support of the building trades in Pittsburgh and Philly, the United Mine Workers, all those folks who work, the Boilermakers, every union that's in energy. They support me, not him.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick, a rebuttal for 30 seconds. Does it concern you about a company creating its own nuclear power plant?
We need to have the appropriate oversight and regulation, but we need to bring in private capital to get our nuclear energy sector back on track. But Senator Casey brought up the border again. I know more about the border. I simply have gone to the border. I don't think you have to be a genius to know that if you have 25,000 convicted murderers and rapists coming across the border, that's a problem. That is the weak, liberal, career politician Bob Casey who has been behind that. So this is about accountability. He's been in the Senate for 18 years, for Lord's sakes. Who is responsible for this wide open border? Who's responsible for this inflation?
Time is up.
Bob Casey would have you think that he was nowhere to be found.
We're going to switch topics. Mr. Casey, you and President Biden both grew up in Scranton. You were one of his closest allies in the Senate. And right up until the day he dropped out, you were supporting his candidacy. Kamala Harris has replaced him. From your perspective, who is the better candidate for Pennsylvania, Biden or Harris? You have 60 seconds.
Well, Dennis, I think Vice President Harris is running a strong campaign. I think she'll carry Pennsylvania. It's going to be very close, just like this Senate race will be close. But she's running a strong campaign. But the people of our state have to make 2 basic decisions in addition to other statewide races. They have to decide in the presidential race. They have to decide in our race. And this race is very clear. There's as clear a contrast as you could get on rights and on fights that a lot of working families want us to engage in. The fight on health care, whether or not we're going to have Medicare and Medicaid cut, or whether we're going to have an investment in our families. Whether or not we're going to have an investment in our families through the child tax credit and a middle-class tax cut, or we're going to just give away the store again, as he wants to do in his plan, to give billionaires the same cuts they got before and to jack up the, or reduce, I should say, the taxes on big corporations.
But in your view, would Biden or Harris have been better for Pennsylvania?
Oh, I don't know, Dennis. I mean, we'll never know the answer to that. But the voters are going to make a decision.
Okay, Mr. McCormick, you've criticized Mr. Casey for voting with President Biden almost all the time. Can you give us one example where you don't agree with Donald Trump on a specific position? You have 60 seconds.
Sure. I don't agree with him. He recently said that he wanted to get rid of the ban on salt taxes, which Senator Casey supported too. Listen, that's a tax break for millionaires in New York and California at the expense of PA taxpayers. So I wouldn't support that. But listen, Senator Casey stood next to Joe Biden when he could hardly finish a sentence. We saw this on the debate stage and said, he's ready to go. Then Senator Casey said, Kamala Harris is great, you're going to love her when you get to know her. This is a woman who in the last few years said she wanted to ban fracking, legalize illegal immigration, give them federal benefits, take away our guns, defund the police. This is her position. So she's flip-flopped on everything, and Bob Casey's standing there by her, and he will be a sure vote. He is a career politician. He has shown weakness when we need strength. He's a 99% vote for his party. He's talking about my independence. He's shown no independence, and he's adopted a set of extreme liberal policies that are truly taking our country in the right direction. So he and I agree. This is a big contrast between the two of us, a political outsider, a West Point graduate, and a businessman.
Thank you. Mr. Casey, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Well, he wants to talk about his business record. Well, here's his business record. He's been investing as a hedge fund CEO, living in Connecticut when he said he was in Pennsylvania, but as a hedge fund CEO, making investments in China, which is an adversary, making investments in, or at least managing money for the Saudis, managing money for President Xi of China, all while helping China rise when our workers were getting screwed. When China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, that's where it began. Our workers started to lose jobs because China cheats.
Thank you very much.
Pennsylvania loses jobs.
Time is up. Mr. McCormick, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
I just remind your viewers to go to CaseyLies.com because he's telling some whoppers. There's a lot of Pinocchios here. But the bottom line is 30% of everything you have in your homes, if you're watching tonight, is made in China. Bridgewater invested 3% in China. And Senator Casey, as the treasurer, oversaw Bridgewater before I got there and approved all these investments. So he's a hypocrite and a liar. But this is a much more important question about what the future holds. So he's trying to attack my record. Listen, he's anti-business, he's anti-success. I've had a successful business career. I've served our country in Iraq in combat. I'm an outsider. He's a career politician, weak and too liberal.
New topic here. Mr. McCormick, former President Trump imposed tariffs, said if elected, he would like to increase them, especially on Chinese products. Most economists say this will lead to higher prices. Do you support those tariffs? You have 60 seconds.
Well, it's interesting. I understand now Senator Casey's running an ad where he's saying that he worked with President Trump on the tariffs. Here's my view on trade. Two things are important. Number one, there's certain industries we have to bring home. We can't have those in the hands of China or anybody else. Pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and so on. And then for the rest of the things we trade, we have to have reciprocity. It's got to be a fair deal. President Trump is using tariffs to ensure we get a fair deal. He did that with steel. The Biden-Harris-Casey team kept those tariffs in place. I'm supportive of using tariffs strategically, as I think President Trump will, to make sure American workers get a fair deal. And that's what I think he'll do when he's president, and I'll support him when he does it.
Mr. Casey, in September, you urged and applauded the Biden administration for increasing tariffs on China, which was an extension of Trump's tariffs. Are you saying the former president was right on that? 60 seconds.
He was, and I said so at the time. I supported the tariffs for steel and aluminum because when you use tariffs in a targeted strategic fashion, you can help our workers and level the playing field, or at least try to, and help our companies. That's what I support. I'll continue to support it. But again, my opponent, he's trying to have it both ways. He talks about tariffs, but what he won't talk about is the plan that he outlined here tonight to double down on those tax cuts for big corporations and wealthy Americans. That automatically puts not only these, but especially these, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid on the chopping block, all to give another tax break to the biggest billionaires on the planet and the largest corporations. They're the ones that are funding his campaign. That's his payoff to them. He's bought and paid for by these big corporations and billionaires, they're paying for his ads, and they want his tax cut.
Time is up.
Yes,
Mr. McCormick, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
For all
Go ahead.
this money that I have supporting me, it's so funny how Bob Casey's outspent me by $75 million. Whoever his friends are, Alex Soros or George Soros or all the people that are supporting him, Bob Casey has a lot more money than me. So I'm the underdog here, and Bob Casey's outspending me by a lot. And it's because they know he's a sure vote. Chuck Schumer knows he can't lose Bob Casey. It's a sure thing, 99% of the time. So Bob Casey is anti-success. You've heard that tonight. He's anti-business. If you get him in the Senate for 6 more years, you're going to see more of the same. More spending, price controls, restrictions,
Thank you, Mr.
regulations.
McCormick. Mr. Casey, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
Look, I know he's going to continue to brag about his record as a hedge fund CEO. So let's talk a little more about that. I talked to you about those investments in China. He's also a hedge fund CEO who silenced women when they came forward to make allegations about sexual harassment. He silenced women. At the same time he was doing that, I was passing legislation with Pat Toomey to get tougher on predators who are targeting minors, and also passing legislation to make it more difficult for anyone to commit the crime of sexual assault on a campus.
Your time is up. I do want to give you 15 seconds just to address that.
Listen, I've got a track record over 25 years in business of mentoring and creating great environments for all workers, including women, minorities. My track record is beyond repute. And Senator Casey, when we talk about sexual predators, they're coming across the border as we speak. Tens of thousands of them approved by Casey.
New topic. Last year, Pittsburgh-based U.S. Steel announced a $14.1 billion sale to Japan's Nippon Steel. Mr. Casey, you've called for the Biden administration to block that sale, but Japan is one of our closest allies, and the company pledged to invest $1.4 billion into the Pennsylvania plant. Why do you believe the government should block a private business transaction? You have 60 seconds.
Hey, Dennis, the key for me are those steelworker jobs in the Mon Valley and the jobs in Pittsburgh, not steelworker jobs, but U.S. Steel jobs. I want to make sure at all costs that those steelworker jobs stay here. They're union jobs. I don't like what I've been hearing from U.S. Steel over the last couple of years, talking about moving those jobs to Arkansas, a non-union state, but that's my prime concern. My concern about Nippon is it'd be a foreign-owned steel company buying the iconic U.S. Steel business and putting at risk those union steelworker jobs. We cannot lose those jobs. It would be devastating for the Mon Valley, and I think it would be devastating for Pennsylvania.
Mr. McCormick, perhaps you agree on this because you've also said if elected you would fight to block the sale. Why do you believe the federal government should be intervening in a private business transaction? You have 60 seconds.
Well, generally speaking, my view will be let's not have the government get too involved, like Senator Casey's always government. But in cases of national security, where a domestic steel industry truly is important for America's future, then I think you got to intervene. And in this case, even though Japan's an ally, Nippon owns operations around the world in China, Iran, Russia, and elsewhere. And I think this does pose national security concerns that you'd have to work through. So I'm opposed for that reason. But listen, this is a beautiful question because U.S. Steel was actually going to invest billions of dollars in the Mon Valley a few years ago. And instead, it took a new plant to Arkansas. And the reason it took a new plant to Arkansas was because the Allegheny County government blocked the new project on environmental grounds. Now, if I was the senior senator from Pennsylvania, I'd be standing on the desk of the people in Allegheny County getting that great investment, those jobs here. This is the kind of failure of leadership that's taking Pennsylvania in the wrong direction. We have a senior senator who keeps his head down and doesn't fight for Pennsylvania.
Thank you. Your time is up. Mr. Casey, I want to give you a 30-second rebuttal.
He was in Connecticut when that was going on, so let's be clear about that. Running the biggest hedge fund in the world, hurting our state when he was investing in China's military, investing in adversaries. So he doesn't have any standing to talk about what should have been done in Pennsylvania. And secondly, when you hear what he just said, he favored the outsourcing, and he's an expert on outsourcing, by the way, favored the outsourcing of those jobs to Arkansas, meaning union steelworker jobs would not be in Pittsburgh, in the Mon Valley. That's the difference between us. I'll fight for those jobs. I'll fight for those union jobs.
Mr. McCormick, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
What you said is exactly opposite of what I just said. I said it was because of regulations, because of Pennsylvania not making itself attractive enough that those jobs left. You should have been a leader in breaking through those regulations and those bureaucrats and that red tape to allow that investment to come to Pennsylvania. We lost those jobs because of you and your failure and your absolute lack of leadership, which is a pattern. Show me a place where you've stood up and made a huge difference for Pennsylvania. You are a weak senator. You're a liberal senator. You're a career politician who wants to have it both ways. Pennsylvania deserves better. We're in a time of crisis.
Your time is up, sir. We're going to change
Dennis,
topics.
Thank you.
15 seconds, yes, sir.
Why don't you show some strength and support the border bill that the Border Patrol supports?
I'd love to answer that.
Number two, he's talking a good game here about U.S. Steel. This is the guy that bet against U.S. Steel, bet on Chinese steel companies, not American steel companies.
Thank you. And you'll both have 90-second closing statements. I want to remind you, new topic. U.S. Surgeon General says the mental health crisis among young people is an emergency, and social media has emerged as an important contributor. Mr. McCormick, you've called for a social media ban for kids under 16. How would you enforce that, and what penalties would you impose on social media companies that don't comply? You have 60 seconds.
Well, listen, I think this is one of many contributors or possible contributors to a mental health crisis, and I know the social media companies are trying to begin to think about how to have approvals and turn on buttons that allow parents to be much more involved in turning off social media. And I think there's evidence to suggest this poses a real problem to mental health. But there's a much bigger mental health crisis than just social media. It's happening in our schools. It's happening across our country. It's happening with veterans, something I've been very involved in. Since Senator Casey's been in office, there's been 20 years of 22 veterans a day killing themselves. This is absolutely unthinkable. It's indefensible. So if I get to the Senate, one of the first things I'm going to do is focus on veterans' benefits. There's a huge mental crisis with mental health crisis with veterans, and work to make sure that the veterans have the care they need so 22 a day aren't killing themselves. This is part of the reason we have a recruiting crisis, part of the reason we have the homeless problem with veterans. It says a lot about a country in terms of the way they've treated the people that serve. I know this as someone who served.
Time is up. Mr. Casey, your Democratic colleague, Senator Blumenthal, supports similar legislation on youth and social media. Do you support any restrictions on children using that? You have 60 seconds.
Yeah, I do, and I just voted for the bill. Thank goodness a bipartisan bill in the Senate to help kids, to protect them, but also to protect their privacy. I want to mention something that Mr. McCormick said about veterans. I commend his service to the country. At the same time, I've also got a strong record of supporting VA health care every time it comes up for a vote, but also being one of those senators leading the way to pass the PACT Act, the first time that we've been able to help those veterans in those who serve near those toxic burn pits. It's a great achievement. More than 1 million veterans benefited from that. On social media, though, here's the difference. I've just voted for that bill, but here's the difference. This is a candidate who invested his own personal money in a website that platforms hate, Holocaust denial, and anti-Semitism. That's not good for anyone of any age to look at, and there's no question that young people see that. And it was a bad investment. I don't know why he continues to make money off of that kind of a platform.
Okay, gentlemen, time is very tight. You will now each have a chance for a closing statement. Mr. McCormick, we're going to begin with you. You have 90 seconds, sir.
Great. This is the most important election of our lifetime. Our country is in trouble. Our Commonwealth is in trouble. We have wide open borders. We have a weak economy. America's going in the wrong direction, skyrocketing prices that are putting enormous pressure on most families. I'm a seventh-generation Pennsylvanian. I'm a political outsider. I'm a businessman. I'm a West Point graduate. I'm a combat vet from Iraq. I'm running because I want to make sure the America I love is available for my 6 daughters, for all of our children. Bob Casey is not just part of the problem. Bob Casey is the problem. Bob Casey's a weak leader. Bob Casey is a career politician. Bob Casey went to the Senate to change Washington. Washington changed Bob Casey. Bob's voted for wide open borders. He voted for sanctuary cities. He's voted against funding for the Border Patrol. He's voted for federal benefits for illegal immigrants. He's voted for all these wild spending bills under Biden and Harris, which have led to an increase in prices for working families. He's been soft on crime. He's been soft on China. He's voted for tax hikes on middle-class workers in Pennsylvania, and he's voted for tax cuts for millionaires in California and in New York. Bob Casey's actually voted for biological males to be able to compete in women's sports. So let's face it, Bob, you are a liberal. And this is not the Bob Casey you elected for office 30 years ago. We need common sense leadership that's going to secure the border, get our economy back on track, and keep America safe. Our Commonwealth deserves change. I'd be honored to get your vote, and I'd be honored to serve as your senator.
Time is up, Mr. Casey. You have 90 seconds.
Hey, Dennis, thank you, and to thank ABC 27 for this opportunity. Every day I've been a United States Senator, I've gone to work for the people of our state, fighting for working families, fighting for workers themselves, fighting for our children, seniors, people with disabilities, our veterans, and I've got a strong record on all those issues. I've also fought to lower costs, to invest in strategies that will secure the border, and to invest in the middle class. That's been my record. While I was doing that and working on behalf of the people of our state, this guy was running the largest hedge fund in the world, investing in China. He increased investments in China by 108,000%. He invested in China's military. He invested in the company in China that made 90% of the fentanyl in China. He invested in Chinese oil companies. He invested in, he managed money for President Xi, managed money for Saudi oil companies. All of those investments hurt Pennsylvania and continue to hurt Pennsylvania. The voters in this state have a very clear choice. They can vote for a candidate who's going to vote against union rights, women's rights, and workers' rights, and voting rights, or they can vote for me, who's going to protect all those rights and fight every day for those families and win like I have. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I respectfully ask for the vote of the people of Pennsylvania on November the 5th.
And we're grateful both of you joined us tonight. That concludes our debate. Thank you both very much for being here. I want to remind viewers that the election day is November 5th. Polls in Pennsylvania are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. I'm Dennis Owens in Harrisburg, and this has been Debate Night in Pennsylvania.
Debate Night in Pennsylvania, sponsored by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association.